Happy Friday.
Friday.
Is that even a thing for people these days? Some people still have like 9 to 5 lives.
I was wondering if you were asking if happiness is a thing for people.
Oh,
I know Fridays are. Happiness, I'm not so sure about that. I'm still working on myself in that regard.
Yeah, it was a pretty rough week, eh?
Yeah. There's so much happening and so much to complain about. But yeah. I don't know. Where should we start?
Well, I feel like, the thing in the news that I have been paying attention to the most is the fires, obviously. I am not in Northern California, although I normally am.
Lucky you, yeah.
Yeah, I feel survivor's guilt about the smoke situation. Should we say what we're doing? Who we are? What's going on?
Yeah, we should probably hit that before we get into it.
Who are you?
My name is Daniel Lee. I'm on the Move to a Man board of directors. I live in Culver City in Los Angeles County.
Hey, everybody. I'm Kaitlin. Posted on that. I'm Move to a Man's national director, and I normally live in Sacramento, but now I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I grew up. So I'm here with family. And feel free to tell us who's here and tuning in, and say hey and where you're tuning in from. Hey, Yolanda. Hey, George. How are you doing? If there's anything you want to talk about today, let us know. So yeah, fires, California on fire. It sounds like the smoke is California and Oregon, and also Washington.
Yeah.
Sounds like the smoke has cleared up a little bit today. I saw lots of folks even yesterday saying that they could breathe for a change. It's a little bit better. It's still like not healthy air quality, but by comparison.
Yeah, I actually went for a walk last night for the first time in like maybe a week and a half. Just because over the last 4 or 5 days, every time I went outside, I instantly had to come back inside and puff an inhaler. In LA, was not nearly as bad as Northern California or Washington or Oregon, where we saw those images that basically looked like Blade Runner, where the sky was orange. I feel like there should have been like Exxon logos like in the sky, like the Batman symbol or something, so people would know. Hey,
What's like an X?
Yeah.
Brought to you by ExxonMobil.
Exactly. Because fires happen like every year. Forest fires are normal. The intensity and the duration of the fire season on the West Coast is never this intense. I feel like every year we have the worst fire in California history. Every year.
Yeah.
And it's baffling how little we do. People always talk about like how little we do at the federal level, but one of the things a lot of groups like the Last Chance Alliance in California, which includes Food and Water Watch, Communities for a Better Environment, Sierra Club, a bunch of smaller groups, is they've highlighted the fact that one, California doesn't deserve its reputation, but two, in the midst of this pandemic, after a pause, our governor, Gavin Newsom, started issuing new oil and gas permits and permitting fracking in the midst of the pandemic. And I think very early on, we knew that pollution and things like that make COVID worse and make the transmission of COVID worse. So to start, to basically let oil companies get back to business as usual very early on, I think it was like March or April, is just mind-boggling. And California in general, we have all of these goals for like 2030 and 2050, But in terms of like actions that the governor is taking, it's pretty much, hey, let's just let the oil companies make as much money as they need to make right now. Like that seems to be the thing, even though he talks a good game. Like in contrast to President Trump, he says the right things. He's a great Democrat, but his actions really don't back up. Don't back it up.
Yeah, and over the last like week and a half, people have been talking about this and talking about, how this means we have to get rid of Trump, and of course we have to get rid of Trump, but missing the fact that the states that are affected here, California, Oregon, Washington, are run by Democrats. And obviously, climate change and climate collapse is not a state by state problem. But the reality is the leaders of each of these states are not doing anything to reverse course. And what was it today that Biden said? Somebody asked him about fracking in light of California situation, and he said, yes, by 2050, we've got to gradually take care of this, and by 2050, and it's like, we're not going to be here by 2050. Are you out of your mind?
Well, and that's the other thing that sort of boggles your mind. It's like earlier this year, petroleum went into negative territory. Like in March, petroleum was like, what like negative $15 or negative $100 or something for, and it only lasted a few days, and everybody blamed the pandemic. But that's actually just a preview of what's going to happen. These are antiquated jobs. It's an antiquated industry. They're going to disappear like that. So holding on to them really just puts a whole lot of people who work in those industries, the middle and low class workers, in jeopardy, because their jobs are just going to disappear. Like the jobs argument, one, in the context of climate change, is like, what are you talking about? We need to survive as a species. But also, these jobs are going to be gone. And if you don't fund a just transition that, transition these folks to like good, clean union jobs, then them and their families are going to be left out in the cold. Like that's what we should be talking about now. I mean, if he doesn't want to call it the Green New Deal, hey, give it another name.
Yeah.
Just do it.
Yeah. Well, that's not on the table at all from anybody in either of the two major parties, even though I would say this summer has made it clear why that's necessary more than ever, and yet continues to do nothing. And so, more of the same on that bad news. And then I saw George said something about the news that of women being forced sterilized in ICE detention centers, with private companies profiting off of that situation. Anything you want to say about that?
Well, I mean, that in conjunction with the Patriotic Education Initiative, like they just sort of make it clear how I feel like people don't really engage with history. Like if we really engaged with history, people would be like, oh, wait, you mean forced sterilization, youth education camps, babies in cages, the military on the streets. This sounds a lot like fascism, but there are a lot of people who are just like, we just need to elect a Democrat. That's all we need to do, and they don't really see that this is a problem that won't go away if we don't actually name it. Like that in particular sort of highlights, I think, really a lot of things related to COVID. A lot of us are rightfully outraged. How can you take someone who's being held? One, they shouldn't be being held. They should either be set free and have a pathway to citizenship, or they should be sent home. Like whatever the decision you make in your administration. But secondly, getting a hysterectomy without your consent, not knowing what a doctor is doing to you, it's basically eugenics. It's forced sterilization. It's let's get rid of this particular ethnicity. It's fascistic. It's fascistic. It's it's incredible that we have to explain why people should be outraged. It's incredible that people don't actually get it. It's like, well, they shouldn't have crossed the border. It's what? What? Have you ever done anything for your family to try to give them a better life? I think you probably have. Um, would you do? Would you flee violence to give your kids a chance to live a life without violence? I think you would. And this lack of empathy is, replicated by the people who don't understand why they should wear a mask. It's like, well, it's not about you. Your breathing is not interrupted unless you're like an idiot. I mean, no offense to people who have anxiety that could be triggered by something like that. That's a real thing, but there's a way to work through that with your therapist. Um, but it's not about you not wanting to wear a mask or you not looking cool. It's about you having some type of empathy for your fellow person. And people just don't get that. So the lack of outrage, the lack of comment by multiple elected officials, though some have made comments, is shocking and distressing. It's like I don't want to go through that Niemöller poem, but first they came for blah blah blah, and then I didn't say anything. It's like they're coming for everybody. They're coming for us eventually. They're coming for us now. Like whether it's voter suppression, kids in cages, forced hysterectomies. Excuse me.
They're coming for you, right?
Yeah, well, they're nice enough to call me ahead of time, which is, I appreciate it. I got time to pack up some things, text my mom. But I mean, it's clear that this administration in particular doesn't care about anyone except, the people within their inner circle and the people they favor. But that's not all that different from past administrations and from certain segments of our political class in general. But the public needs to know these stories and really needs to say something and demand that exactly, Lynn, silence and complacency is murder. Which is why I was, very heartened earlier this year when so many people who aren't people of color spoke out and got into the streets, and a historic reckoning around white supremacy and police brutality. But I think, we need to broaden the scope of empathy so it's not just trending. So it's not just Me Too now, and then, oh, now it's Black people and police brutality. Oh, and now it's this. It's something that should be practiced more generally, and it should relate to everyone, no matter what particular category they fall in and at what time.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that the example is set by leadership, and the example is terrible, and so we need to take it upon ourselves. I mean, and what I mean by that is, obviously Trump is just heinous, and the the people who are part of that administration, and yet what was the attempted impeachment of Trump over? Not crimes against humanity, which is the most basic thing that we should all be responding to in terms of what is happening here. But the reality is that, kids in cages and mass deportations and all of that is not really something that the leadership of the Democratic Party is really willing to take a strong stand against, because, Biden has been really clear that he's not going to slow deportations, and Obama deported more people than any president before him, et cetera, et cetera. And so, while obviously, the Trump administration is kind of being much more overt and taking it one step, 12 steps further, the reality is that there's no sort of moral high ground place that the leadership on the other side can really come from against it, because this is all a continuation of policies that have been happening in many ways since way before Trump. And as Anonymous Incarnate says, it's what really is at the root of so much more than just like one person or the people who are in charge like a second.
Which is true. And I feel like the other initiative that I mentioned before, um, as I don't know, one of the characteristics of fascism is the attempt to erase history. I feel like last week, Trump was uh, saying a lot of stuff about the 1619 project and, trying to sue school districts that would teach it and all of that stuff, which is, I think, legally impossible. But since someone told him, probably told him, sir, that's impossible, and that's really a stupid way to go about it. Now he's talking about having these patriotic education camps to teach children the real history of the United States, which basically just means erasing history. Because I mean, the 1619 project really, got deeply into America's history and the fact that the foundation of America and the foundation of capitalism is chattel slavery. And it, really traced the history of chattel slavery and its economic and, systemic intertwining with, American democracy. And one of the most honest ways, of course, it won a Pulitzer Prize and all that jazz. Um, but in one of the most honest ways that we haven't really seen from mainstream media in a while. The New York Times gets accolades as the paper of note, but during the lead up to the Iraq War, the Times, the Washington Post, they were beating the drums of war. For a very long time, a lot of their reporting around police brutality and corporate power has been incredibly lackluster. Uh, so it's with these projects like the 1619 project where it can actually shine, and it's something that we should hold up rather than having a very Hitler-esque education camp for kids to basically brainwash them with propaganda. I mean, I had a conversation with a couple friends. I forget where I was, but I was traveling with a group of friends outside of the U.S. And it's weird how we recognize the incredible level of propaganda in other places, particularly in China and Russia, places where it's pretty blatant. But we don't recognize those elements here. We don't question why we sing the national anthem before basketball games and football games and baseball games. Do we need to be reminded that we're still in the United States because we went to a stadium? Do we constantly need to be reminded about war when we're supposed to be entertained? It's a weird thing, and I mean that's just one small element. If you look at the propaganda in the United States, uh, I mean, Chomsky obviously has some things to say about this, and manufacturing consent more generally. But it's astounding the lack of I guess self reflection that we
Yeah,
have.
critical
People,
thought
yeah,
about
and not just people on like one side or another, like Americans or residents of the United States. Americans are in North and South America. But it's astounding. But these camps are trying to make it more blatant. I mean, I thought they already had Jesus Camp. I thought that was already a thing. Like is this like Jesus Camp
it
2?
bigger and better.
Yeah,
Um,
the
well,
sequel.
one of the things. So my family on my mom's side is Slovak from the former Czechoslovakia, and one of the things that I have heard is that in the former USSR there was a sense of like there was tons of propaganda coming from the state, but everybody was sort of suspicious of everything. So, it was kind of like, okay, well, if this is what's being said, then what's really going on? And there was just a sense of like what we're being told is not real. Um, and I don't think it makes sense to take it to some sort of like conspiracy theory level, but the reality is there is a consensus on the part of the elite of what how things will be talked about, especially if we're talking about on like mainstream corporate media, and what gets covered and how it gets covered. and the depth to which the analysis goes. And we just don't have that critical sense in this country and skepticism of the corporate dominant media, in part because there's this idea that it's like independent from the state. But you know, that's really not true. It's not financed with tax dollars, but the folks who own the companies that own the media stations are the same folks who buy our politicians and determine, who we're going to have to choose from to vote for. And so, we need that level of skepticism that we really don't have, and it's really, really
Yeah, I mean, that just underlies the importance of independent media. I think a lot of people have done um, either articles or in-depth studies about the notion of just access on one hand, where these large or small media companies want access to the president, to senators, to whoever, and as such they tailor their stories to be just so critical but not too critical, so that they can maintain their access. And then on the other hand, um, they trend towards the sensational, since there's been this merger of news and entertainment. And of course, Fox News is perfect at this. They're like, well, these are our opinion shows and these are our news shows, which really doesn't hold up if you go to a place like Media Matters that does a whole lot of scrutiny of Fox News. Like, there's a whole lot of overlap between their entertainment and news shows. But the point around entertainment sticks. One of the reasons that Trump was covered so much in the 2016 election is because he got ratings. And it's a vicious circle where it's like, okay, the more ratings we get, the more money we get. And then, you can just imagine a boardroom, someone raising their hand. But what about democracy? If we just, do this for ratings, then aren't we imperiling democracy by enabling someone who obviously wants to be an autocrat and has no skills or knowledge for this position? And that person, you can just see that person being fired, like, basically, like, why did you bring that up? We're trying to make money. And I feel like that's the focus. That's the focus of so many things in our system. It's something that we don't call out. And, frankly, it's one of the reasons that the work that we do at Move to Amend and the We the People Amendment is so important. I think we need to take power out of the hands of corporations more generally, but specifically, media corporations. What happened to things like the Fairness Doctrine and net neutrality, and all of these things that were put into place to protect consumers, but also to protect, the variety of different viewpoints, to provide space to really have news that isn't just filtered by the people in power and isn't really just what they want you to hear. I mean, all of that stuff really just goes back to corporate power. And the media companies in our country, which are mostly multinational companies like News Corp, are incredibly powerful. And they have too much of a stranglehold on our system of government, which, people think is democracy, but really isn't.
one of the things that I thought that we talked about talking about was the story that I think you shared it on the Move to Amend's social media about how folks knew that plastic wasn't recyclable like so long ago, and then here we are, and it's like, what am I going to do with all this stuff? Can you tell people a little bit about that who missed that story? Because I feel like that's just so indicative of where we are now, and who needs to be in prison and isn't going to happen soon, but ultimately where we
Sure, yeah, and we've been sort of looking at this locally on the city level in Culver City. As we passed a plastic bag ban before I was on the council. We passed a polystyrene ban, and in both instances, functionally, after doing research and talking, with different groups like Surfrider and the Plastic Pollution Coalition and various other environmental groups, I was pretty, confident that even though styrofoam and various plastics are listed as recyclable, they don't actually get recycled. And a lot of that is due to contamination or, the way they look or whatever. The blockbuster story that came out this week is that petroleum companies, and I'm going to say this because not everybody knows plastic is petroleum. Plastic comes from petroleum. A lot of people don't know that. But, a few years ago, the big story broke that in the 70s, scientists within, ExxonMobil and all of these other companies knew that climate change was real. And they basically just hedged their bets and decided to make as much money as possible as they could before government regulations came down on them. This week, we found out that the other thing that they knew was real in the 70s, I think it was like 1971, 72, was that plastic is functionally not recyclable. It was a decision and a choice to market plastic as recyclable to increase its use. If they said that if the notion that plastic isn't recyclable came out, then consumers would feel guilty and they would buy less of their products. So let's perpetuate this lie. And if you go to any landfill, or if you ask anyone who's in the recycling industry, plastic messes a whole lot of things up. There are a whole lot of things that would naturally biodegrade over time. Some things take longer than others, but plastic just sits there, and it impedes the ability of other things to really just become a part of the soil. But basically, a lot of people have been railing against environmentalists for years. They're like, oh, you're just trying to bring down industry. You're trying to do this. You're trying to do that. But I think, this story this week lets us know, one, okay, we were right to target oil companies in particular, because one, they knew that they were accelerating climate change and they didn't care. Two, they put plastics, many of which, have, BPA and other toxic chemicals into our food supply, kept them into our food supply, even though they knew they were not recyclable because of money. It's all because of money. And anytime someone makes some weird market-based argument to me, I'm like, okay, so who does the market exist for? Is it people? Because if it exists for people and it keeps messing up this much, then I'm not going to depend on the market anymore. There's a lot of talk that the market will create solutions to climate change, to recycling, but we've seen with this story and the one that preceded it around climate change that they don't care as long as they make money. The market isn't about doing what is best or what will provide the biggest benefit for the most people. It's around making money for the people who have some stake. That's it. There are no moral concerns. The market is not moral. It is not ethical. Appeals to the market, therefore, are not moral or ethical either.
Well, and also I mean, the fact that the market is completely manipulated is obviously part of it. But even if that were not the case, by the time it kind of gets to that level, as George says here, it's like there's plastic in our food supply, there's plastic in our water. We have no sense of any kind of precautionary principle built in, and so companies are able to just do things, create things, and by the time we find out that it's harmful, and then maybe there might be some kind of market. I mean, there like people are trying to buy in a more environmentally conscious way now than they used to, but it's like too little, too late. That's not and also, you have to have the resources to be able to make those choices anyways, and oftentimes that's not an available choice for people. And so how much poison has to happen before by the time people are able to make a company or industry obsolete through market choices.
Exactly, exactly. It should be the job of like policymakers and the government. And some companies, I mean, some countries are moving towards this notion where uh, companies that have a whole lot of plastic, within their manufacturing, supply chain, they need to be responsible for the product, and it's carbon and it's recycling, throughout the life cycle of the product. Like the company's responsible, and I think that's where we need to go. I think there are some countries that are trying to make sure that they don't pass that expense on to consumers. But even if a little money is passed on to consumers, that's where we need to go. Like the companies need to be responsible from the time this bottle is created to when it's filled up with like soda or detergent or Clorox or whatever, to when it gets to the store, to when it's used, to when it goes to the landfill. Like they need to bake that into their budgets, because it's their responsibility. Um, and whether that's the petroleum company that provides the container or the company that buys it from the petroleum company, those companies need to be responsible. The buck has been passed on the consumer to the consumer, and inadequate education has been passed on to the consumer as well. It's like, oh yeah, you can recycle. Let's not really recycle.
Well,
Like
yeah, all the straight up lies. I mean, the amount of, I mean, one of the other projects that I work on is that I'm involved with this beauty company, and the stuff that I have learned about how there's been almost no regulation. There's no regulation over what words are used, images. So it's like why your milk has a picture of like a cow in a pasture instead of a freaking factory farm, which is actually where it comes from. So to say that okay, this is for people who are buying the product to research and determine. Meanwhile, we are like literally selling them the opposite of what it is that's in this container or what this container is possible, like you said, in terms of it's not, it has a little recycle thingy on it with a number, but that doesn't actually mean anything. All of that needs to be set at the policy and governance level. And that's so much of what's wrong with obviously the United States, but then capitalism in general, that none of that is seen as a responsibility to the public on the part of private companies. All of that is up to them. Whatever they can kind of sneak past us, they can get away with until they get caught, and then maybe they get fined. And if they're a big enough company, those fines are no big deal whatsoever. And so that's sort of incorporated into the cost of doing business, and then carried on. Meanwhile, the planet is suffering incredibly as a result of the system, and all of it comes back to just what we prioritize in terms of how we decide how much power we will have over how things will be, or whether that will just be left up to the people with the resources to decide what's in our food supply, what's in our air supply, what's in our water.
well, and
So
a lot of it goes back to this distorted notion of freedom that we've seen on display this entire summer when it comes to masks and armed people not wearing masks and spreading COVID, to everyone in their neighborhood. Um, this same distorted notion of freedom makes people really, into the notion of corporate personhood. It's like, well, it's a bunch of people and they're a corporation. They should be able to do whatever they want to do. So, like, when a corporation does lie, you know, they're protected by the First Amendment. A corporation says, "Oh, this beauty product is all natural," even though we created it, from a bunch of chemicals that we also created that aren't on the periodic table. Like yeah, that's why there's so much organic food out there now that you didn't know was available before, because basically it's not organic. But like these labels and or lack of labeling, all of this goes back to corporate personhood and the fact that corporations can claim the same rights as we have, which is, functionally absurd. But in like a mutated notion of freedom, it makes complete sense. Just like, wearing a, thin sheet of, you know, cloth or whatever over your face is oppression. It's oppression. It's exactly like slavery. It's exactly like forced sterilization. It's exactly like concentration camps. Exactly like it. No argument.
Not exactly, but it is a slippery slope.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Doctors telling you what to do?
Well, so one of the things that we also wanted to talk about, and our coworkers shared, there's not really a way that I can put it up, it looks like, but Senator Marsha Blackburn, yesterday was Constitution Day. Senator Marsha Blackburn shared this tweet that says, in 1787, our founders signed the United States Constitution, laying out the principles that still guide our great nation. And then she also said, we will never rewrite the Constitution of the United States. I just want to point out that every amendment and the Bill of Rights itself is basically a giant rewrite, and many of the amendments for that. But we did want to talk about Constitution Day a little bit, and I think we can slide over to that in terms of this conversation about freedoms. And first of all, I want to invite everybody to an online participatory discussion that we're having, a People's Movement Assembly in October next month on towards the People's Constitution, because we very much disagree with Marsha Blackburn. This country and every country's constitution. I mean, the idea that people who, first of all, owned human beings and didn't believe that the majority of people are human beings would have all that we would want in terms of, where they would be coming from and what we would want our governance to be. But even if we kind of like put that aside for a second, these are folks who created governance at a time before we had, the internet, before we had airplanes, before we had cars, before we had climate change, before we had almost anything that is relevant to people today. And this idea that we wouldn't have the right as people right now living in the world as it exists now, where women and Black people and Indigenous people and other people of color are actually human beings, unlike it was in our founding fathers' minds, that we would not have the right to re-examine our foundational documents and make sure that they're serving us, make sure that they don't need to be updated, is ludicrous. And also I feel like extremely anti-American if we want to get patriotic about it too. So we're going to start to have that conversation. We've actually been having that conversation for the last 10 years, but we want to put it out there in a more explicit way. Say, what if our Constitution was a document that actually prioritized human rights over property rights, and understood, unlike most of the framers of the Constitution, that what's most important is human rights and rights for the planet, and started there. What would it look like? And so we're not going to rewrite it that weekend, but we are going to start to vision what it would look like if we actually had it.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And I usually look at it, well, in realistic context and a bad joke context, which you'll have to excuse me for. But in a realistic context, beyond the preamble to the Constitution, what most people love about the Constitution is the Bill of Rights, which, came later and was a compromise, or is, one of the 27 amendments, basically. So, it automatically, makes a really good counterpoint to Blackburn, because it's like what people really like. It's just like, what people like about the U.S. government it's usually some type of semi-socialist policy. Like they like Social Security. They like roads. and things like that, things that we collectively pay for. They like the commons and things like that. when it comes to the Constitution, people all often like to say, if the founding fathers were alive today, well, one, they'd be incredibly confused. They probably think that everything was a monster or a dragon. You know, there's a Hard Times, a satire site article that they reposted that they wrote a few years ago that basically said, if the founding fathers were alive today, they would be bloodthirsty vampires, which is true because how can you live like 400 years like unless someone turns you into a vampire? Like that's just impossible. But I think their priorities would also be different, as children of the night.
Also, who cares? I know that that's like, not something you're allowed to say, but like, who cares? I'm gonna say it.
No, it needs to be said. Like, there's this assumption that, like, science marched on, literature marched on, anthropology, sociology, social work, psychology, all of these disciplines came into being after the founding fathers died. Yet they are like, the standard for wisdom throughout the ages until the end of time. It's ludicrous. It's dumb. It's not something that we should venerate. Like, we should venerate maybe some of the intentions, but we shouldn't talk about people uncritically. Like, we should not talk about anyone uncritically. These were slave owners. These were people who didn't think women were even up to their level intellectually. These were people who thought, enslaved Africans were 3/5. These were people who thought it wasn't even worthy to mention the indigenous people who were here for hundreds and thousands of years before them. I just, if I meet a person like that now, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna walk away because you're a Nazi, or I'm gonna, if I'm in a work environment, I'm like, not working with that guy. Like, these are people, if you just take those characteristics by themselves, that you wouldn't want to be around. And I'm not gonna say that these people have a monopoly on wisdom and knowledge. There are a lot of things that we can do differently, and a number of them, in fact, despite their faults, were knowledgeable enough to say things like, you should update this Constitution every 20 years or every generation.
Exactly. It's like, are we gonna, either you're holding Jefferson up in high esteem or you're ignoring him. But even the idea that this Constitution would have lasted as long as it did is anti many of the framers' idea of how it should have been. So even if you are going to say, okay, the Lord is God, then we still need a refresh. So I want to invite everyone to join us for that. I will try to post the link to the event so that folks can RSVP. We've already got 75 people who are interested in coming, which is great. We just announced it yesterday with Constitution Day. Thought that was a good time to put it out there. So join us. And we have also we were talking about climate change earlier, and we have another event that we're doing in October as well, joined by some folks from some other organizations. The topic is the immorality of the climate crisis and corporate rule. So that's on October 6th. And I think that'll be a really interesting conversation. I'm actually going to be part of it, kind of from the Move to Amend side. And it'll be, I think this is so important for us to start to talk about in this way. And, it gets tossed around that it's an existential crisis, but, like, what does that mean that we're going to change about how we do things as a result of it? Or are we just going to, wring our hands and then let it consume us? We absolutely have to move forward with addressing it. It's not even on the table anymore. It's too late for that.
Exactly. And I feel like, when people talk about it as an existential crisis, I think, to some people, that's a means to not do anything about it. It's like, well, it's so big, and frankly, I don't think people understand the phrase existential crisis. Like, I would say, it's an extinction level event. Like, this is about the species, but then I would also say it's an existential crisis to people who have privilege. For people who, for instance, live on the West Coast, in the last few weeks, it is a now crisis. It is a I can't go outside crisis. It's a my sky is red and it looks like Blade Runner crisis. It's a, if I'm a Black person or a Latino person or a person of color in general, my neighborhood is incredibly polluted, and climate change will only make it worse. And the people who look like me will be the first people who get sick, will be the first people who die, will be the people who can't afford, to make, personal climate mitigations to push off, the personal effects of climate change for 5, 10, or 20 years because we don't have the resources to it. It's the people who are suffering from it right now. It's not existential. To them, it's like a day-to-day thing. It's this makes my life harder every day. This makes my children sick. This is why I have emphysema. This is why I have cancer. It's an everyday thing. This is why, I have to live somewhere else, because our housing policy is so messed up. I have to live, hours and hours away and, burn all of this fuel to go to work because no one's doing anything systemically when it comes to climate policy. People are, pecking around the edges. We're not asking for real systemic change from a climate level. We need that when it comes to white supremacy. We need it when it comes to policing. But we need it. We're at the same crisis level when it comes to climate change. It's affecting all of our lives on a day-to-day basis, and it's not something that's really going to hit us in 10 years or 20 years. It's something that's hitting us right now. And for people who don't have the privilege to fly to somewhere else or to go to their other house that's not on the West Coast, it's really immediate. It's acute.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these last weeks, if you didn't have air conditioning, you had to close off your house and or yeah, just live with it, which is a lot of California. There's no reason to have air conditioning, and so people don't, and or can't afford it, or couldn't afford to run it all the time, and then you're just breathing this air that's noxious. Um, and the thing is, fire season hasn't even really started yet. We're not even in fire season in California. So, this is at this point, these fires have been going until November, into December. And so there's no end in sight. And we're just in 2020. This is the new, every year, every week for the rest of the year, potentially. And with the huge shortage of firefighters because of COVID, and the fact that our U.S. military is sending our technology, our helicopters, off to, drop bombs on people in other countries instead of having them here to fight fires. I mean, it's a giant mess. It's the climate crisis plus the fact that we are completely incompetently governed and have been for my whole lifetime to deal with this situation, even though people knew that we would be here. Maybe it's a little sooner than we thought, but there were definitely people who were saying, we're being conservative with our estimates and we have to be ready. And we're absolutely not.
Yeah, and I mean, even with like people's estimates when it comes to like the amount of CO2 in the air, or the amount of methane in the air, or the amount of like temperature increase year to year, like I feel possibly because people's estimates were so conservative, almost everything's coming up worst case scenario. Like almost every measure that we've been tracking, like the reality is worst case scenario because we're not doing anything to address it. We're not changing our behavior like on a systemic level. It's not going to be like, me and you, carrying our reusable bags to the grocery store. That's not going to do it. That's just not going to do it. Like it's really going to take systemic changes and large state and federal policy interventions that don't do things like cap and trade, that do things like cap and punish and shut down if you continue to pollute. You know, like this is something that we need to address in a way that actually has consequences. In the same way that, you know, one of the ways that you really end police brutality is ending qualified immunity, having consequences for officers that are involved in something, having consequences for officers that, you know, see something negative happening and not reporting it. You know, that's the same thing with climate change. You know, don't just find a polluter that makes billions of dollars a year. You know, $1 million. You know, find them $1 billion, $2 billion. If they continue polluting, shut them down. You know, make sure that we actually have consequences. If we just have flowery language and talk, then, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, the climate crisis and our eventual extinction will sound good. You know, we'll have a lot of great orators, you know, narrating our doom, but the doom will still be there if we don't actually have any action.
Well, and the only way that all of that is going to happen really is because it's not like the policies need to be thought of that should be implemented. It's the power to actually implement that, which is why, you know, we're talking about this as a democracy organization. And I want to take head on a question that I see that somebody on Facebook is asking about, you know, are we diluting our mission? Why are we not working to pass the amendment before rewriting the Constitution? And I just want to be clear that, okay, so first of all, this step is not rewriting the Constitution. It is envisioning what it really should say. And the only way that these things happen is if we first have the vision of what is needed. And that's what Move to Amend has been about from the very beginning. So we're not going to stop working on our amendment, but the amendment is a means to an end. The amendment is a way to get to political power for the people. And we do still see it as a very strategic, you know, fundamental step towards that. But at the same time, I don't know how we can be here in 2020 with the reality of everything fundamentally falling apart around us and still be talking about, you know, kind of small measures and little steps. And so somebody needs to start to put forward an even bigger vision of where we need to go, because otherwise we could end up taking steps and we're not working towards the vision of where we need to be. The reason why we're in the situation where corporations have more rights than people is because property, which is what corporations are, is held as like the most important thing in our society, and everything else comes second. And so property and maximizing profits and consolidating property is the highest priority, and people, the planet, our health, our well-being, our happiness, all of that comes second. And so unless we start to talk about this on this more fundamental way, to say, you know, that's not what should be the foundation of this country. And because this country is the most powerful country in the world and makes it its business to get into everyone else's, therefore that's the policy of the globe and of humanity at this point. And that's so fundamentally wrong that we can't, you know, put forward a policy and think that that's going to solve the problem. We have to completely change around what we think is most important and who we are as a species and how we conduct ourselves. And to me, this year has shown that that's not a project for the future. That's a project for right this second. If we don't start to do it right this second, by the time we get around to it, there's going to be hard landing.
Yeah, I completely agree. There was a point where, you know, I was of two minds about moving forward with this type of conversation. But I think, you know, the events of this year and the way that people are talking about reimagining or re-envisioning so many different things makes it a really optimum time to have that type of conversation. Because, you know, we can talk about, when we talk about policing, we inevitably talk about white supremacy. And when we talk about policing and white supremacy, we inevitably talk about the foundation of this country, which was built on slavery. And when we talk about policing, we obviously talk about slave patrols as the first police. When we talk about slavery and slave patrols, we're really talking about our economic system and the way that it has basically been hybridized. Like the slave patrols have been hybridized. They've led to mass incarceration. We talk about that in terms of oppression, oppression of people of color, Black people in particular. But what are the other elements of that system that still exist? And I think a lot of the elements are, divide and conquer, um, the privileging of those who already have money, the degradation of our environment. I think all of these questions are really tied up in our economic system. And when we talk about, I always say, when we talk about our system of government, most people say democracy, but when they describe the elements, they're talking about capitalism. And people really don't know, you know, how to distinguish the democracy they think we have from our economic system. And I think, right now is the time where people are having deeper discussions. And I think it makes a whole lot of sense for us to say, okay, so if we had a system of public safety that was really based on prevention, and a lot of people are talking about housing, social services, jobs, things like that, how can we broaden that discussion and say, okay, not just public safety, but existence, day-to-day life, the type of country that we want to live in, where we don't have to constantly fix things. Like, what would that look like? The type of company.
Just to jump in, I mean, I think that what you're describing, Daniel, is like, if these things are such a failure, I mean, what we saw with what we're seeing, because it's still underway, with the pandemic and the climate collapse, kind of happening at once in this crucible moment, is that our constitution, our economic system, our policing system, our political system, none of those things are actually adequate to solve this, because here we are in meltdown, and all of them are inadequate. There's nothing that we can use to draw from these systems that is actually helping people. In fact, we're just moving backwards in terms of people's well-being and the planet's well-being, and our environment in the United States well-being. And so that's a really good time to put on the reality glasses and say, like, look, this isn't working. Nothing about this is working, and so there's no reason to keep it going, because it's because it's what we have been doing. In fact, perhaps that is why we are in the situation that we are in, and now's the time to slam on the brakes and reassess.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like that's a great place to stop, partially because I have to jump on a meeting. But I think that's a great way to end. It's like, okay, if this isn't working, what would work? And let's have that conversation. Like, what would work? What are the things that we need to have in place to have the system of government and governance that we want, that is really there for everyone? And I mean, I'm really looking forward to that conversation, and I hope as many people as possible across the country join us.
Absolutely. So again, if you go to movetoamend.org/PMA, you can learn more about that and be part of that conversation. And then for folks who are asking, I've seen some questions about, where are we at? So if you go to movetoamend.org/amendment, you can see what the status is of the amendment right now. If you go to movetoamend.org/pledge-amend, you can see the candidates this year who have signed up to support the amendment if they are elected to office, and that list is ever growing. So join us for those events, and you can kind of find out those details there. And everything is at movetoamend.org if you want to learn more. And we're here every Friday, and so we'll meet Daniel and I next week. But you should tune in, and we'll continue the conversation. And the main thing about Move to Amend is that we have never been afraid to sort of name how deep the problem is and how deep of a solution we need, and that's what we'll continue to do. And so as we see that everything is breaking down and not working for us, this is the time for us to say, okay, well then we need to do something different, and not be slow or incremental about it, but instead be sweeping and fast and visionary.
Another world is possible.
All right, thank you so much, Alfonso, for doing the engineering here, and check us out at movetoamend.org for more, and hope everyone has a good weekend and stay safe.